In April 2018, Arizona's teachers engaged in a statewide strike. Tens of thousands of teachers wearing red descended on the state capitol, demanding a 20% raise.
This movement was born out of the experience of looking into our students' eyes and knowing that our state, the people who sit in this building, do not fund their success. That's what started this movement. That's why we're here.
How did we get to this point in Arizona? In 2008, the legislature slashed the education budget in Arizona, cutting it by 25% and cutting capital budget by 90%. One result of these budget cuts is that teacher salaries were either cut or remained stagnant for years, not keeping up with inflation. Over the next decade, the economy in Arizona gradually recovered, and with it, state revenues went back up. But the educational budget was never fully restored. In 2018, after a large budget surplus was projected, the governor promised to increase teacher salaries by 2%. The leaders of the legislature rejected that, saying that 1% was all that could be afforded. This meant that teacher salaries would again not keep up with inflation. The legislature claimed that while they valued education, there simply was no room in the budget for a meaningful salary increase for teachers. At this time, a national movement emerged called Red for Ed, as teachers around the country sought to draw attention to their low salaries and poor working conditions. In Arizona, the Red for Ed movement mobilized teachers and supportive parents around the state, demanding that teacher salaries be increased and the funding cuts from a decade earlier be reversed. When their demands were not met, they organized a statewide teachers' strike, calling for a 20% raise for teachers. The teachers had widespread support. There was a lot of public sympathy for them and an understanding that they had not been treated fairly over the past decade. Given the level of support of the public and the high-profile nature of the strike, the governor reversed his position and began to support giving teachers a 20% raise. The legislature then agreed to allocate funds to enable a 20% raise distributed across 3 years and began to draft legislation to do that. Even though an agreement had been reached and the legislature had given in to most of the teachers' demands, when the day ended without a bill being passed, the teachers felt betrayed and their leaders decided to continue their strike until a bill was passed and sent to the governor. Another 2 days went by until that happened. The fact that the strike continued even after the teachers had received their demands shows both a lack of trust in the legislature and a lack of knowledge of the legislative process. The lack of trust is easily understandable, as the legislature had made and broken promises to educators in the past. The misunderstanding of the process, however, was avoidable. The teachers seemed to be unaware that it would take a couple of days to move their bill through the process. They spent more political capital than needed and did lose some support because they decided to continue their strike into a new week. Had the teachers better understood the process, they could have achieved their goals while avoiding the extra cost. This video and the next will outline what the legislative process is and how it plays out at the Arizona legislature. The formal legislative process has lots of steps and is rather complicated. This reflects the seriousness of public policy. Before an idea becomes a law, it's important that the idea be fully considered, with opportunities for experts on both sides of an issue to weigh in, with an analysis from staff on the financial and legal consequences of a new law, and multiple readings to ensure that both the public and the lawmakers fully understand the steps that are being considered before a vote is taken and the policy becomes law. Understood this way, the very fact that the process is complicated is a positive reflection of the fact that we live in a democracy where voices are heard and the public has opportunities to provide input before laws are enacted.
So I imagine that from the outside looking in, the complexity and all that's involved in trying to build a majority for whether it's the budget, which is the most complex thing we do, or just some simple issue seems like it's more difficult than it should be. And the truth is, it's because we as a legislature, even though we are one branch of government, we are divided into two chambers. We have 30 personalities in the Senate and 60 in the House, and you have two different parties, all sorts of different constituencies. And so getting agreement is pretty difficult because people have very strong opinions about things, and they are representing a constituency that has very strong opinions about things. And it's not as simple as, you want a cheese pizza and you want a pepperoni pizza, so we'll just get half and half. If it were that simple, that would be excellent. But for the most part, you're dealing with far greater complexities, obviously, than that, but even just a wide variation of views out there. This place, the Arizona House, is where different worldviews, different value systems, different political ideologies all converge. And so it's very messy, and it can be very dramatic.
The process begins with an idea. This might be a pet project of a lawmaker, or a concern or idea that was brought up by a citizen or industry group. Anytime someone thinks there ought to be a law, then follows up on that impulse, the legislative process has begun. The next step is to write up that idea into a formalized, legalistic description of exactly how and where existing law will be modified. Once the idea is written up this way, it is called a bill.
As a legislator, I take concerns that I am getting from my community, from my constituents, and I start with talking to legislative staff about what laws might already exist to address this, or what statutory changes we could make that would address this issue. And then at that point, kind of decide if we can move forward with legislation, if that's the best option, or if there's a different option, a different route that we want to take. And then that process goes from there in terms of legislative council drafting a bill and that bill getting introduced and the whole process.
Well, the role of legislative staff in the drafting of legislation is very, very significant. We have an arm that we call the Legislative Council, and that is a group of attorneys whose job it is to draft legislation. And so, for example, let's say that I had an idea for a bill. I would make an appointment with the subject matter expert at Legislative Council, and I would go sit with that person. I would say, here's my idea, here's what I'm thinking of. And they would ask questions and then ultimately turn that into a draft. I would look at it, get back with them, maybe meet with them a second time to arrive at what we call an intro set. A second way that staff influence drafting is that each committee has an analyst. They work primarily for the chairman of the committee, but if you were in that role, you would go to that person and they would assist you in drafting the bill and in actually proposing amendments if you wanted to do that as well. I look at it this way. I know how to drive a car, but you would not ask me to race in the Daytona 500. And so these people have that kind of expertise, and that's why they play a really critical role. They are nonpartisan, and they do a great job for both sides of the aisle.
Only a member of the legislature or the governor can introduce legislation, so the bill has to be sponsored by at least one member of the legislature in order to be formally introduced. It is good practice to find more than one legislator to sponsor a bill. The number of sponsors and who those sponsors are is a signal to other lawmakers whether or not the bill is worthy of support or likely to succeed.
Only elected legislators are allowed to introduce bills. They'll kind of start with an idea, of course, and then they'll take that idea to legislative council. They'll talk about it and get with legislative council staff to draft the legislation. Once that legislation is in proper form, they'll take it to the Secretary of the Senate or the Chief Clerk's office, where they'll drop the bill in the hopper, as they call it, and it'll begin its journey.
When the bill is formally submitted to the leadership of the House or Senate for consideration, it is called being put into the hopper. This term harkens back to the agricultural roots of the state. A hopper is a funnel that feeds grain into a mill. The legislative hopper is, figuratively speaking, where a member throws their bill so that it can be fed into the legislative process.
The nonpartisan research staff will also help with amendments and any changes, and any step along the way they're making changes to these fact sheets and to these summaries.
At this point, the bill is given a first reading. Part of being a democracy is that the public is supposed to be aware of what the legislature is doing. Back in the distant past, perhaps the bill was actually read in the first reading by a clerk. In the modern era, the first reading is really a public notice that a bill has been submitted so that the members of the legislature and the public can mobilize support or opposition to the bill. After the first reading, the leadership of the House or Senate assigns the bill to a committee. This is an important step and is one indication of whether or not the leadership supports a bill. A bill might be assigned to a committee that is chaired by a close personal friend of the leader who can be expected to follow directions. Or, if a leader wants to kill a bill but does not want to take credit for killing it, he or she could assign the bill to 5 or 6 committees, figuring that it is unlikely that the bill could survive all of them. In general, committee assignments are made not for those political reasons, but are sorted by topic. Legislative committees have expertise over certain areas, so bills dealing with those areas will be assigned to those committees. Once the bill is assigned to a committee, it is given a second reading. This is once again a public notice letting everyone know which committee the bill has been assigned to, so that supporters and opponents can mobilize and prepare to influence that committee's decision. The committee will usually hold hearings on the bill, though it doesn't have to. At the hearing, supporters and opponents of the bill give public testimony about the bill and its consequences if passed. The chair of the committee controls this process and can decide how much time or how many witnesses each side will be given. The process is usually fair, but occasionally it is manipulated or shortened as the chair sees fit. After the hearings, the chair will decide whether or not to call a vote on the bill. After the hearings, the chair will decide whether or not to call a vote on the bill. Committee members then vote to pass the bill up from their committee or to kill the bill right then and there. This process is called marking up the bill. Most bills do not survive committee and are not marked up.
There are multiple ways that citizens can get involved and communicate with their legislators. Here in Arizona, we have something called ALICE. It's a way to sign up, and even from their homes, they can kind of weigh in on hearings and different meetings that are happening where they're at home and they're online and they're starting to communicate with their legislators here. That is direct, and it is something that has a tremendous impact at that level. But on a more global scale, when you look at Arizona, you look at municipalities, or you look at the nation at large, it's emails, it's knocking doors, it's making phone calls, it's setting up meetings with your legislators to try to help them understand where you are. Every single person in this country is a special interest, right? Because you're uniquely different. And so when we engage people, we want them to understand that that unique difference really does have an impact. When you look at elections that are won just by a few votes or not, that means that people are paying attention, they're engaging in the process. But if you don't communicate what you want as an outcome or what you define as the best outcome, then you're not going to have it. Likely you're not going to have it at all.
Once a bill is marked up by all of the committees it was assigned to, it then moves to the Rules Committee, at least in the House of Representatives. The Rules Committee is chaired by the Speaker of the House. The Rules Committee decides whether or not a bill will be heard on the floor by the entire legislature. In addition, when a bill is debated on the floor, the Rules Committee decides whether amendments will be allowed, how many speakers get to talk about the bill, and how long each speech can be. Basically, the Rules Committee, as its name suggests, determines the rules that will be applied to the bill when it is debated by the full legislature. Once the Rules Committee has decided which bills will be considered by the entire legislature, that list is sent to a separate meeting of legislators who belong to the same political party. This is the party caucus, where all the party members try to get on the same page prior to the public debate that will happen on the floor. The party caucus is a private meeting. There are no microphones or cameras allowed. The majority party can amend bills at this stage so that the bill debated on the floor may look different than the bill debated in the committee. The minority party might generate amendments to propose, but they cannot simply amend the bill in the party caucus. After the party caucus, the bill is debated by the full legislature on the floor of the House or Senate. This is referred to as the Committee of the Whole, or COW. Once debate has ended, there is a final third reading of the bill. This is necessary because the bill may have been amended after it was marked up by the committee, either by the Rules Committee, the Party Caucus, or as a result of floor debate. This reading is for the public record. After the third reading, a final vote is called for, and the lawmakers vote yes or no on the bill.
Another great way people can convey their policy ideas is to come down to the legislature. All of our hearings are open to the public as well as our floor sessions. People can have a chance to see it, how it actually happens down here, and see how things unfold. We have information desks in both the House and the Senate where you can go and ask questions and get an idea of what's happening that day. People can visit the House and the Senate, and both chambers have an information desk where you can go and research agendas, ask questions, request to speak, and they can assist with that. And that's another big thing, is coming down and registering to request to speak. And you can leave your comments for the record. That's a really big way to convey your feelings on a piece of legislation.
If the bill is passed by a majority, it is then passed over to the other branch of the legislature, where it is put in the hopper and goes through the entire process again. If the bill survives and it is passed by the other branch, it then goes to a conference committee. Once a bill has gone through the committee and rules and amendment processes of both houses, it is unlikely that the two bills will be identical. The conference committee is an opportunity for representatives from both houses to discuss their respective bills and find a way to synthesize them into one comprehensive bill. There is often quite a bit of negotiation that occurs at this stage, since the politicians in the two different houses often have very different agendas. The agreed-upon language for the conference bill is voted on. Like any other committee, if a majority votes yes, the bill survives. If a majority of the committee members votes no, the bill would die at this point, even though both houses had voted for it earlier. Once the conference committee passes the bill, it has to go back to both houses for a new floor vote. This is because the conference committee bill is probably not identical to the bill passed in either the House or the Senate. It is a new bill. Both houses need to approve a bill before it can become a law, so this is why they have to vote on the conference committee bill. Usually, no amendments are allowed at this stage because if one of the two houses amended the conference bill, it would become yet another new bill and would have to go through another conference committee. The conference vote is usually a simple yes, no, up, down vote. If the conference committee bill is approved by both houses, then the bill is sent to the governor's office for signature. If the governor does not like the bill, the governor can veto it, sending it back to the legislature. The legislature can override the governor's veto with a supermajority. Supermajorities are hard to come by, though, so the governor's veto usually stands. Once the governor signs the bill, it becomes law 90 days after the legislative session ends, unless it is emergency legislation. Emergency legislation requires a 2/3 vote in both houses, but takes effect immediately after the governor signs it. When the bill becomes a law, the ASRS is modified. This acronym stands for Arizona State Revised Statutes. ASRS is the law of the land, and that is how a bill becomes a law.
My freshman term as a legislator was a very long time ago, about 16 years ago when I was a freshman here in this house. And I came with a philosophy that I could learn a lot more if I listened rather than if I talked. Now, I'll concede that apparently a lot of modern freshman legislators don't seem to hold to the view that I had, that you learn the most by listening. But that was my approach. I tried to do that. I also learned in my freshman year something that my parents had already taught me, and that is your word has to be 100% your bond. If you give your word, then you better do exactly what you said you were going to do. And the other thing is, I learned very, very quickly that if you treat people with dignity and respect, then eventually you yourself might grow into leadership as a result of that. What I learned as a freshman was listen, don't talk very much. In 4 years, I had 4 bills that I got all the way through the process. In the next 12 years, I had, I don't know, over 90 bills, and some of the very most significant bills in Arizona's recent history. And so I think that may show that, at least I hope, that my approach as a freshman ultimately was beneficial in the long run. Told you it wouldn't take long.